Coronavirus has changed all of our lives, but how will it impact the future? Does this change everything? I'm Matt Rees. On this episode of Does This Change Everything? Data privacy. Will the coronavirus cause governments or other institutions to track our data more deeply than they did in the past so that they can better track the infection? And once the coronavirus crisis is over, will our privacy have been eroded? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? We'll find out from Dennis Kessler, who heads the Data Governance Unit at the European Investment Bank, the EU Bank. Dennis, does the coronavirus crisis change the future of digital privacy?
It doesn't necessarily change it, but it will inevitably. As far as privacy is concerned, there's legislation that's been introduced, most notably the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, by Europe, which has emerged as the global gold standard in such legislation. Now, there are a lot of people writing and concerned about the fact that the measures which need to be introduced to combat the spread of the virus involve increasing amounts of surveillance, increasing amounts of intrusion into people's private lives and their movements, especially through the tracking applications that are being developed to be installed on people's smartphones. Now, this shouldn't cause a concern because everyone is going to be agreeing that the preservation of life and public health is absolutely the priority. But the big question is what will happen afterwards. And once a lot more safeguards have been eroded or compromised, once a lot more personal data is in the hands of governments and private corporations, what will happen to it?
One of the medical experts on another of the episodes in this podcast series said that he hopes medical treatment will become more digitalized because it will help doctors deal with pandemics as well as other diseases in a very quick, efficient way. That means doctors accessing our medical data digitally, and you can't get much more private than medical data. Do you think it's inevitable that we are going to have to accept a broader digitalization of our privacy?
I think it is inevitable, but the real question is not broader digitalization of privacy, but about aspects of our lives, all aspects of our lives, all the ways in which we live and the services we consume and the services that are provided to us. Data protection, data privacy protection, and the legislation and regulations are in place to try to make sure that these services can be provided in ways that don't compromise our privacy, but we still seek to find the balance with all the benefits that we get. So we take for granted interacting with our banks online, shopping online, storing personal documents, storing photos, consuming music. All of those activities leave traces, and that's not even to mention social media. It seems obvious to us that there are data traces and evidence of our digital activities, and we seem to be continuing to be happy to do that, knowing that the data is out there. But we seek reassurance from government authorities that the data is not being abused and it's being stored and protected in ways that we would expect in the kind of society that we live in. It seems absolutely obvious that anyone seeking medical treatment would want to make sure that medical practitioners have available their medical records containing both medical history and also any alerts about medication they're taking, any allergies. It's fine to be able to recall all that information when you're there and conscious seeking emergency treatment, but it's very beneficial for practitioners to know what the person's medical history is, especially if they don't have all that information available or they're not able to share it themselves. There's no question that the future of medical care lies with digitalization of personal health data at its heart. And people receiving improved medical treatments would support that, but they would still expect that the powers that be are making sure that the right safeguards are in place to ensure that that sensitive data is only made available when it's needed to the people that need it to provide those services.
Well, let's talk about some of those, the idea of safeguards. You talked about the apps that some governments are thinking of introducing as a way to manage the end of the coronavirus lockdown. How broadly are those being considered, and how likely are we to see them introduced?
Well, it's happening right now. Singapore was an early example of developing an app that would trace people's contacts if they were found to have been diagnosed as positive. It's been well accepted by society in Singapore, although the adoption is low. It's estimated that it needs to be at about 60% of adoption to be effective, and the actual take up is much lower than that. The UK government and the National Health Service is developing a contact tracing app that's about to be launched, and this will use Bluetooth technology. The idea being that if someone is found to be positive, they can find out who had recent contact with that person and notify them, so that those people that might not be experiencing any symptoms to find out if they can get tested, and if so, start self-isolating. It's generally accepted by epidemiologists and medical professionals that this is the key. Quick contact tracing is the key to containing the virus. The challenge is, what will happen to all the data? Firstly, what kind of data is being captured? Is it personally identifiable data that can then be used by private companies in the future to identify a person's movements and what they consume, where they've been, what they like to do, and how long will it be kept and used for what purposes?
Is that really what this is all about? How private companies would use it? Because when you read about this in newspapers, there's always this Orwellian fear that the government or a government will, for example, say, "Oh, you're a political dissident, so we're going to tell your coronavirus app that you are infected, and therefore you have to stay home." So effectively put you under house arrest. But actually, it seems that you're saying it's more a matter of our data going to private companies who will then use it to get money out of us, essentially.
There are two aspects to this. The example that you've just given is no longer science fiction. It's already been done. It's already happened in China. Classification based on data profiles has been applied to minorities in China to restrict their movement. And there's already anecdotal evidence that people that have been given the green status in China, which allows them to leave their home or move out of their registered city, there are cases where erroneous yellow or red ratings, which restrict their movement, have been placed on them due to technical errors, but the people haven't been able to get that removed because the processes for making a complaint or making an appeal are not clear. In addition to that, there would be very little accountability in such a society if a politician or the police, who have access to this data, by the way, decide to put a red marker on someone, even if it has nothing to do with their health status. So these are not just fears about the future. This is happening now in parts of the world. The question is, what are the safeguards to prevent those steps being introduced in supposedly Western liberal democracies if the platforms and infrastructure is already being built and adopted by citizens?
Well, so there we're talking now about a time of emergency, but once the threat of coronavirus recedes, as we hope it will it be possible to roll back these changes in the privacy of our data, or should we even want to roll them back?
Well, the desirability is clear. Once you began by asking about our data being in the public domain, and the whole point of GDPR and similar legislation, such as the California Consumer Protection legislation that was introduced last year, but which is being increasingly respected in other parts of the US. This is about making sure that individuals, consumers, citizens have control over what data is stored by private companies, how it's used, for what purpose, and their right to have it removed. If we lose control of that, then the data, our personal data, becomes able to be used by not just governments, but for private organizations for reasons that are driven by profit. Now, people will accept these if they feel that they're getting some benefit, at least to some degree. But when it comes to the motivations of private companies, there's an incentive to get insights into personal data for profit purposes. So, for example, if there were aspects of your lifestyle that you didn't want to be disclosed to an insurance company, but an insurance company could find out that they could put you into a category of someone that was higher risk for something, you could end up being charged higher insurance premiums in a way that hadn't been disclosed and wasn't transparent. Private companies seeking to hire candidates or select candidates for a particular job could get access to personal data, your private history, your private activities that you hadn't authorized, but they could use that to influence their decision about the kind of person that they wanted working. So the goal of this legislation is to let people control what data gets shared, what can be done with it, and what can't be done with it, and their right to have it withdrawn from unauthorized use.
Let me ask you about when this goes wrong. Just this week in Wales, 13,000 letters were sent out to the wrong address, telling people you're at risk of coronavirus and therefore you can go to the front of the line at the supermarket, things like that. And they were sent to the previous address at which those people had lived. So out of 80,000 letters that were sent out, 13,000 went to the wrong place. And the government said, oh, we're sorry about that. How often does that kind of thing happen, and how damaging is it to our privacy?
The question of how often it happens is hard to answer, but the regulations that are in place, and let's just talk more widely about a culture in which organizations or even government departments are more accountable for what they do with personal data. This means that such incidents are supposed to be reported. They're supposed to be disclosed to a data protection authority in the government. Most governments have one, and GDPR says that organizations and indeed authorities need to have a responsible officer. Such breaches need to be reported and disclosed within a particular time frame, and there are penalties for not doing so. The fact is that the rise of awareness of the value of data, both commercially and for people's private freedoms and privacy, is becoming more widespread, which is why there's the growing awareness of the tension that this current crisis brings between the need to preserve public health, which is unquestioned when people's lives are at stake, and the need to make sure that any information that's gathered about people in the current situation is carefully managed and not used for other purposes, whether it's deliberate or accidental, once the crisis is over.
Well, let's look at that. What effect might these changes have on everyday life for citizens once this is all over? How much will our data privacy have changed?
Well, we can expect that the use of these contact tracing apps is going to be extremely widespread starting right now. It's already happening. What that means is it sort of opens the door to people being more accepting of the fact that their movements are tracked, and they will trust governments and trust the responsible authorities to be using that information in a responsible way. But if you think about the way in which the use of social media has exploded, people share and take for granted sharing more and more insights into their private lives on a forum and using a platform and infrastructure where they don't know who has access to the data, they don't know where the data is being stored. Very few people, unless they're brilliant technical specialists, understand the complexity of the infrastructure that Facebook uses to manage its services, let alone Amazon with all of another example, eBay, of all the shopping activity. What this opens the door for is people being more accepting of sharing more and more information and using more and more applications which are being offered ostensibly to make their lives easier. And I'm no different from anyone else in enjoying the benefits of these services, especially when we're in this lockdown environment. It's hard to imagine how difficult this experience and how different this experience would be if it was 15 years ago when we weren't able to take for granted having all these facilities. But the danger is that people start to accept the fact that they carry around a smartphone which has these tracking applications, but they're not paying attention, and there isn't enough scrutiny applied to what's happening to that data and who has access to it and the purposes that the insights are being used for. As an extreme case, there are already situations in China, and try to imagine this, where the smartphones that we have, the applications that we're talking about, we have these by choice. No one is forcing us to have them. When we talk about a smartphone, it's not really a phone. It's an incredibly powerful handheld computer that just happens to still have a phone facility built into it. Some of our grandparents, we've given them simple phones that actually have numeric keys on them that just make phone calls and do nothing else. But in parts of China, there are places where people have to have a smartphone. They're not being asked whether they want it or not. They have to have it so that their movements are tracked. There's a very nice article that was published on the BBC News website, which is an anecdotal tale about a student who was confined under lockdown in his apartment in Taiwan. And when his mobile phone, he had one of these tracking applications, when his mobile phone ran out of battery and went offline, he had officials rushing to his door within the hour, demanding to know where he was. He was supposed to be in his apartment. And when his phone died, they assumed that he'd left his apartment illegally, breaching a control regulation. And it's hard to imagine, but becoming closer potentially, a situation in which we are told that we must have a smartphone in order to conduct day-to-day life, and that phone must have certain applications activated in order to be functioning legally and interacting in civil society. If that takes place, that has to be something that people are choosing to do, not something that's imposed by stealth by governments, and especially driven by private sector interests.
In all this, what role can the European Investment Bank take, do you think?
This is a very important question because the EIB is one of the high-profile European institutions that, especially as a member of the Eurogroup, is emerging as one of the key players in the rescue plan that is being put together to try to help the European economy to recover. Now, something that is little understood and has been overshadowed by this crisis is that in February of this year, just 2 months ago, the European Commission, on behalf of the EU, published a new multi-year data strategy encouraging the digitalization of every aspect of EU society for the benefit of civil and economic prosperity. Now, hardly anyone noticed this because the news was starting to come in about the impact of the virus. But this has, as a huge component of it, a very big focus on data and a very big focus on artificial intelligence. The goal in this data strategy is to create a single market for data, where data is flowing within the EU and across sectors with full respect for privacy and data protection, where rules for access are fair, but where there's an enormous benefit to the European economy as a global player because of this new data economy. But given the fears about the misuse of data, the EU also set up has launched a strategy on the use of artificial intelligence. It had a working group on investigating how to produce trust, how to ensure trust in the use of artificial intelligence. And these were published in 2 white papers that unfortunately seem to have been overlooked with all of the focus on the crisis. One white paper on AI is called A European Approach to Excellence and Trust. So the answer to the question is that the EIB can play a really important role in ensuring that when it's evaluating the loans that it provides to counterparties, it takes into account not just the usual know your counterparty and anti-money laundering due diligence investigations about where the money is going to, but also to ensure that the organizations that are benefiting from the lending will be aware of and respecting European standards and regulations on the use of data to ensure that the legal and ethical practices are respected. The EIB can emerge as a leader in the area of data ethics, making sure that not just the letter, but the spirit of these regulations and the principles of preserving data privacy and protection are not just respected, but help to be established throughout the European economy and society.
Thank you, Dennis Kessler, head of the Data Governance Unit at the European Investment Bank. This is Does This Change Everything from the European Investment Bank, the EU bank.